All right, start the recording.
I can't hear anything.
Unmute it.
I did. All right. Welcome, everyone. We are going to get started now, and welcome to Testing to Expect or Expose, Direct-to-Consumer Genetic Testing and Gene Doping by Tara Balin and Arden Meyer. My name is Kim Pearson, and I will be your Now I
moderator
have sound, yeah.
for this session. And
All separate incidents in the past year.
sorry, let me just mute a little bit here.
Someone multiple times. Either way, it looks like they
Right. So if you haven't already done so, you want to mute yourself. It's in the bottom left of the screen, the microphone. In addition, I recommend that you put the view into speaker view, which is in the top right of the screen. Okay, so during the presentation today, we do have access to the chat feature, and you can find that window by clicking chat on the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. And you can enter in any questions during the session and send them privately to me, Kim Pearson, and I will share them when appropriate. But also note that there will be time for questions at the end as well. So with that, I turn the session over to our presenters.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tara.
And my name is Arden, and our presentation is titled Testing to Expect or Expose, Direct-to-Consumer Genetic Testing and Gene Doping.
My presentation speaks more to the exposing portion of the title,
while mine is related to the expect.
I explored gene doping and whether it is worth it or not to expose the cheaters.
And I focused on the direct-to-consumer genetic test of 23andMe to examine whether it's worth it or not to test to expect, or to learn more about your future genetic health.
So we would like to begin with some polling questions to test your existing knowledge on our topics, as well as some of the prevalent ethical values involved with our presentation.
So the first question is, DNA is defined as a self-replicating material present in nearly all living organisms. And this is a true or false question.
The next question is also a true or false question. Genetics is defined as the study of how to increase the occurrence of desirable hereditary traits.
The third question is, do you believe that it is fair for athletes to modify themselves to increase their athletic performance? This is a yes or no question.
The next question is, have you ever taken a direct-to-consumer genetic test such as 23andMe?
The fifth is, would you be willing to entrust your genetic information in someone else's hands?
And the last question is, which of these values is most important to you, autonomy or privacy? So I'll give you about another minute just to finish up the polling. And with the yes or no questions, there are no right or wrong answers, and these are all anonymous. So it seems like most people have voted at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. But if you didn't get a chance to vote yet, it's okay. You can just follow along with the results.
Okay, so it looks like most of you got the first question correct, which is a good sign.
So the next question, the answer is that it is false. The definition of genetics is actually the study of heredity and the variation of inherited characteristics.
For the third question, you all mostly said that it was not fair for athletes to modify their athletic performance, and we'll see if that changes throughout Tara's portion of the presentation.
And for Arden's presentation, this is good information to know. And for those of you who haven't taken a genetic test before, it'll be interesting to see your stance on it by the end.
The fifth question was mostly split 50-50, and this will also be interesting to see the change as the presentation goes on.
And finally, the two values mentioned at the end are the most prevalent connection between our two topics, and we will expand on them towards the end of our presentation.
So the values mentioned in the polling questions are the most prevalent in the connection between our two topics, and they will be expanded on later in the presentation.
So I'm going to go ahead and get started on my portion. If possible, to not be drawing on the screen, that would be really helpful because there are images on the slides. Thank you. So firstly, to get started, I would like to explain what doping is. So doping is defined as the illegal consumption or administration of drugs to enhance an athlete's performance. Some common forms of doping include blood doping, the use of human growth hormone and anabolic steroids, or masking agents that make it difficult to detect these substances in urine. The main reason people might dope is because they feel that it'll increase their chances of winning. Often this feeling comes after many wins, not from the start of a career. Another reason that people might dope is because athletics are a very nature versus nurture type game. The likelihood that an athlete can be successful really differs based on the environment that they grew up in. Athletes are aware of this reality and potentially want to bridge that gap in competition levels. Gene doping is slightly different from regular doping. Gene doping is defined as the transfer of genes or genetically modified cells into an individual as a potential method for illicitly enhancing athletic performance. I'm now going to go slightly more into detail on the gene doping process. Scientists inject what are called vectors or transporter genes into the cells and muscles. They can also alter an individual's genes by removing cells, but that's a far more invasive and difficult process. The most common form of vectors are viruses because of their ability to lodge themselves into DNA. Typically, these are harmless strains of a virus. Doctors would not take the risk of injecting strains of the flu virus, or such as now the COVID-19, into someone's body, as it would greatly increase their chances of illness. Injections of the virus are directed right into the specific muscles to be altered. This prevents the possibility of accidentally injecting growth proteins into eyes or something else. The gene doping process is essentially the same as the process for genetic therapy. In genetic therapy, when a particular gene is not working, a procedure is done to replace the gene or alter it slightly. The purpose of gene therapy would one day be to one day get rid of many health problems such as muscular dystrophy or various kinds of anemia. Gene doping is effectively exactly the same procedure as gene therapy, but is viewed as much more of an abuse of this technology. While standard doping has been around since the early 1900s and was banned by the International Olympic Committee in 1967, when research into gene therapy began in the late 1990s, it was not at all linked with performance enhancement or athletics in any way. Ultimately, scientists theorized that through gene therapy research, if the right segment of DNA was altered, athletes would be able to alter their genomes to help enhance their athletic performance in competitions. A form of gene therapy known as EPO that increased the red blood cell count was among the first to be linked with performance enhancement. The treatment's initial purpose was to help patients with sickle cell anemia, but it became clear to athletes that EPO would increase their chances of winning were they to inject it. This is because the more blood pumped during a competition, the faster and more aggressively an athlete can perform. Athletes then began to explore EPO and its uses and benefits. However, the World Anti-Doping Agency could see that this was happening and could potentially change the future of sports. Therefore, they formally banned gene doping in 2003, despite little evidence of it actually occurring. Though there are some benefits to gene doping, such as the ability to do so without getting caught, which I will discuss later, there are many risks involved. One of the short-term effects is an immediate immune reaction. While undergoing genetic therapy could just lead to a small fever or illness, it could also lead to a variety of more dangerous immediate reactions. The athlete's body might attack the virus delivering the gene, and make their body very sick. Additionally, there's the short-term risk of uncontrollable hormone productions. With the use of certain gene therapies, red blood cell counts could even become too high, and blood could thicken into a fatal and sludgy consistency. Or, as a result of the modification, cells can divide uncontrollably and form tumors in the body. On the idea of uncontrollable cellular division, we can come to some of the more long-term effects. Cancer is certainly one of them. Not only could tumors that result from uncontrollable cell division become cancerous, a genetic modification could turn on a cancer gene or turn off a cancer-suppressing gene. If the gene inserts itself into a bad place on the chromosome, it can then turn on a cancerous gene as well. The effects of gene doping could even spread to the children of athletes. The most common genetic mutations are typically mutations to sex-linked chromosomes. If there are any mutations to the sex-linked chromosomes as a result of gene therapy, the mutations can most definitely be passed on to offspring. What makes it more dangerous is that this is not preventable because doctors cannot remove genes from cells and surgeons cannot cut out cells that have been transformed. It's important to keep in mind that gene therapy isn't mastered yet. That's why it's strictly regulated in the United States and in many other countries, and there's a huge likelihood that rogue experiments will occur. It's very difficult for scientists to treat the unwanted effects of any sort of gene therapy. Because of this, gene therapy is very risky, especially for frivolous and unnecessary things such as athletic performance enhancements. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, how is doping detected? In the case of regular doping, athletes have to undergo 8 drug tests, including blood tests, urine tests, before every major competition. This even includes the collection of a urine sample, blood sample, and in some extreme cases, even a saliva sample. In the case of gene doping, the only way to detect an alteration to a gene sequence is by doing a genetic test. It's illegal to require athletes, however, to take DNA tests before competition. That's why, as of 2019, there are still no confirmed cases of gene doping. Drug testing samples go through a huge process in which it is very easy for athletes to lose their information. First, there's the collection step. A doping officer is responsible for managing the sample. They are present for the collection of the sample as well. They also make sure that the athlete fills out the appropriate paperwork before they can go any farther. Next, there's the transportation stage. Following the collection process, the sample is shipped to the World Anti-Doping Agency lab. Occasionally, the sample has to undergo an additional sterilization or stabilization process. After that, there's the inspection of the sample. Though this step seems somewhat useless considering the protective measures placed on the samples at the start, the World Anti-Doping Agency puts a huge emphasis on this. They want to ensure that there is no tampering with any of the samples, so the results may not be changed. The lab then begins the analysis process, in which they actually test the samples for any signs of drug usage. This step usually takes the longest, usually about a few weeks. Finally, they can move on to sending the athletes their results post-testing. But the sample's journey does not end there. The remains of the sample are stored and can be kept from anywhere between 3 months and 10 years for further testing. In the case of a urine or blood sample, there isn't much that can happen if those items are lost. The consequences are minimal. But what could happen if genetic information could get out? Would an athlete's privacy be entirely violated? This makes you wonder if genetic testing is always more helpful than harmful. And that's something Arden will continue to talk about in her part of the presentation.
Hi, so before I begin discussing the research that I've conducted on the direct-to-consumer genetic test of 23andMe, I would first like to begin with a polling question. So at this moment in time, how many of you would participate in a 23andMe test? You'll have about 30 seconds to answer this question. So I couldn't have asked for more split results. We'll see how your opinions change throughout the presentation. So first, I would like to define direct-to-consumer genetic testing. This is defined as genetic tests that are marketed directly to consumers and can be purchased either online or in stores. A prime example of a direct-to-consumer genetic test is 23andMe. So now I would like to show 2 different videos comparing different experiences with the results of the 23andMe tests. The first video demonstrates a negative experience, while the second demonstrates a positive.
Her husband was interested in his ancestry and asked Shapiro if she wanted to take a genealogy test.
I felt like I was pretty clear on my family tree. I said, sure, why not? And I didn't give it another thought. I would have expected it to be, well into the 90%, up to 100% Eastern European Ashkenazi.
Shapiro's test results told a different story.
It showed that I was 52% Eastern European Ashkenazi. And the other 48% was English, French, Irish, German. My initial response to that was, that's crazy. That's not true. That's a mistake.
But that was not all. When she compared her results with another family member, tests revealed she wasn't related to them at all.
that was the night that my life changed.
Why didn't you get the 23andMe test?
Well, it was World DNA Day, and I thought that we would find out if we had sweet taste buds or sour taste buds, or, I always thought that I was of Eastern European descent.
And it was a life-changing moment. When we opened up the results, we found out that I had a BRCA1 gene mutation, and I was shocked.
I Googled around quickly, and within 5 minutes, we knew that this was bad.
I found out that I have a higher chance of ovarian and breast cancer. After getting the results, we met with a genetic counselor. We talked about options for treatment. We also did a genetic test and confirmed that I was BRCA1 positive. Having been retested by the doctor, I found out that it was more than 80% chance that I would have breast cancer in my life. If someone told you that there was an 80% likelihood that the plane was going to crash, you would not get on that plane. So I consulted with genetic counselors and with doctors, and they all confirmed that I should have a double mastectomy.
So I understand how it may seem bizarre that the woman discovering that she had the BRCA mutation to be a positive experience. However, this allowed her to catch the mutation before it turned into cancer. She had a double mastectomy to eliminate this possibility, which was a positive outcome in her mind. This had a great connection to our title, Testing to Expect or Expose. The woman in this video tested to expect and received more information about her future health. To speak more to the video about the negative experience of 23andMe, I thought that it would be best for you to experience it firsthand. So imagine that you lived with your family all of your life, only to find out that they were your social family, not your biological family. Imagine how devastating that would be and difficult for you to comprehend. So just keep these videos in mind throughout the rest of the presentation. The science behind 23andMe. 23andMe analyzes an individual's DNA by looking at genetic variants across the genome. This could involve chromosomes 1 through 22, sex chromosomes, and mitochondrial DNA. A genetic variant is defined as an alteration in a gene that makes an individual unique. 23andMe decides which version of the genetic variant an individual has by using genotyping. Once the lab receives the individual's sample, the DNA is extracted from the cells contained in the participant's saliva. The lab copies the DNA many times, utilizing a process known as DNA amplification. The amplified DNA is then cut into smaller pieces and is put on a DNA chip or a microarray, which is a small glass slide with beads. Each bead on the microarray is given a probe, or a piece of DNA that matches with one of the variants that are being tested for. The smaller pieces of DNA then stick with the DNA probes, and a bright label on each probe identifies which version of the genetic variant the participant possesses. Reliability of 23andMe. 23andMe claims that their tests are 99% accurate, but that still leaves a 1% margin of error. One main underlying issue with the company of 23andMe is the lack of thoroughness in their testing. The BRCA genes and mutations are one of the most shocking examples. 23andMe tests for very few out of thousands of genes and factors that could determine the risk of breast cancer. This information displays how little the results are based off of. 23andMe is providing test results saying that individuals are positive for a genetic mutation when they've only tested for 3 out of 1,000 genes or factors that could truly determine their disposition for this mutation. There has also been a history of false positives in 23andMe. These false positives either cause an individual to feel unnecessary angst about their current and future state of health, or it causes them to spend more money to visit a genetic counselor to conduct the same test, yet more thoroughly. Genetic exploitation and risks. Genetic exploitation is defined as the sharing of one's genetic information to a third-party source without their consent. There are 2 main risks of genetic exploitation. 1 is a loss of privacy, and 2 is genetic discrimination, which will be touched on later in the presentation. 23andMe promises individuals that their personal data and DNA are stored in a de-identified manner, and that they will not be shared with a third-party source without the participant's explicit consent. Despite promises, a participant's personal information being leaked is still a possibility, which could lead to genetic exploitation and discrimination. it is possible for a participant's genetic information to fall into the hands of a future employer, insurance company, friends, or family members. This is an obvious loss of privacy, and do individuals want others to know about their genetic profile or what lies in their genes? Who could possibly receive your genetic information? This question refers to individuals who could receive the participant's information if 23andMe is hacked or if the participant's information was sold to a third-party source. Although the participants of 23andMe's test results and DNA are stored anonymously in a database, hackers still have the possibility to access the database and steal or view an individual's genetic information. 23andMe states that participants' DNA is de-identified and can only be used by outside sources with their consent. De-identification is the process of removing the participant's name and personal information from their DNA. Others may want the participant's genetic information to conduct research on genetic disorders, to sell that information for profit, to find more information on the test taker, and even to solve crimes. A possible employer or insurer may want an individual's DNA to determine insurance rates. For example, if someone has a risk of developing breast cancer, the insurer may make their rate higher. Other individuals who could receive the participant's genetic information are medical researchers, pharmaceutical companies, market research companies, and journalists. Genetic discrimination in GINA. Genetic discrimination is one of the main consequences of genetic exploitation. It has the possibility to replace the old-fashioned form of discrimination. Genetic discrimination is defined as individuals being treated differently because of their genetic profile. Consider this hypothetical scenario. You've completed a 23andMe test and the results are fairly reassuring. However, you have a 4% higher chance of developing Alzheimer's in your lifetime. One day, you decide to apply for a mortgage and you're not granted a loan because of that increased risk. This is a consequence of your information being purchased from 23andMe. Although this scenario may seem extreme, it is a possibility and one of the consequences of genetic discrimination. GINA, or the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, is one of the main acts attempting to prevent genetic discrimination. It was enacted in 2008. GINA protects individuals from information derived from family health history, results of genetic tests, the use of genetic counseling and other genetic services, and participation in research. So after learning about the positives and negatives of 23andMe testing, has your original opinion about participating in a 23andMe test changed? I would like to read you the polling question that was posed at the beginning of my presentation. So at this moment in time, how many of you would participate in a 23andMe test? Once again, you'll have about 30 seconds to answer this question. So now it's interesting to see that the majority of you would not participate in a 23andMe test versus the results in the beginning of my presentation stating that it was 50-50. Okay. So now we will delve into the ethics portion of our presentation, beginning with stakeholders.
So my first stakeholder is the World Anti-Doping Agency and other anti-doping agencies. They have the job to ensure the fairness of a competition. To what lengths should they be going to ensure this fairness?
A similar stakeholder are the owners of 23andMe. 23andMe is administering these genetic tests and analyzing a participant's DNA, so they play a large role in the process of genetic testing.
Another stakeholder would be the athletes competing. Even those who aren't doping are required to submit their genetic information for testing. This would result in every athlete allowing their genetic sequence to be viewable to anti-doping officials. Even those not at fault would have to partake in this.
Similar to athletes, these tests also impact the individuals who participate in testing. These individuals are submitting a sample of their DNA to be reviewed and analyzed by genetic professionals, so there are a lot of benefits and risks on the table.
Those reviewing the information are also a stakeholder here. With great power comes great responsibility, and they have a job to keep this information private. There could be many consequences for leaking the information.
The processors and reviewers of genetic information are also a stakeholder here because the valuable information that lies in the genetic test results could be used for a variety of things, such as future medical treatment or for discrimination.
Lastly, the families of the athletes are a huge stakeholder here. The interesting thing about genetic information is that it obviously does not just belong to you, it belongs to your entire family line. The families of the athletes now also potentially have their genetic information out in the open.
Similar to Tara's final stakeholder, family members of the participant are often overlooked as a stakeholder. When an individual submits their DNA to be tested, they also submit the DNA of their family members. Their family members may not want to know if there is something negative in their gene pool, which could have a potentially negative impact on family dynamics. To quickly expand on that idea, I would like to return to the video that I played earlier about Dani Shapiro. Her 23andMe experience had an extremely negative impact on her life as well as her social family's dynamics.
So one value that both of us explored in depth was autonomy. Athletes should be entitled to their own personal choice would be an argument for entitling them autonomy. This should not be taken away from them. Another argument for entitling them autonomy would be what I mentioned at the very beginning of my portion of presentation. Athletics are a very nature versus nurture type game. Allowing athletes to have their own choices about whether or not to gene dope could, in a sense, level the playing field for them. One argument against entitling autonomy to athletes is that it is unfair for the other athletes who put in the work to perform at a high level to lose to those who use gene editing techniques to enhance their performance. Additionally, the public loves to watch sports. Allowing athletes to potentially turn themselves into superhumans with gene editing techniques, if they wish, would not be well received by the public. Entitling athletes to their autonomy in this case could eliminate the desire for the public to watch sports altogether.
My first argument is that taking the 23andMe test is a form of autonomy. Taking a 23andMe test is a personal decision made by an individual to learn more about what lies in their genetics. Is it truly a violation of autonomy if the individual chooses to participate? My second argument is that 23andMe is providing individuals with more autonomy because they are informed about their future state of health. This will give individuals more options about their future plan of action because they are more informed and have more information about what genes they carry, mutations they possess, or genes that they might pass down to their children. A counter to that argument is that 23andMe is violating an individual's autonomy indirectly. When individuals discover information about themselves through 23andMe, whether positive or negative, they are forced to make decisions about their future health. These decisions could stem from taking precautionary measures, getting further testing done, or ignoring the test results. The results could also prepare individuals for the future, whether the results are positive or negative. They will either be watching their health to attempt to prevent these genetic disorders, or they will not have to worry about them at all. Another counterargument is community need versus individual need and the test taker's decision on others. Genetic testing is a personal decision to learn more about your genetic makeup. Earlier, it was mentioned that these tests not only impact the participant, but they also impact their immediate families and distant relatives. Taking the test could result in other family members learning about what is in their genome, whether they want the smell of it or not. The ethical value of empathy applies to this situation because if you had a potentially dangerous disease lying in your future, would you want to know? For example, if your sibling took a 23andMe test and found out that they had a BRCA mutation, do they have the obligation to tell you? What if you don't want to know? Will they respect your wishes or tell you anyways?
Another ethical value that we both thought about in depth is the value of privacy. My first argument about why athletes should be able to keep their privacy would be pertaining to who gets to handle the genetic information. As I discussed earlier, with great power comes great responsibility. It raises the question of who should be allowed to decide who gets to view this. Should it be the athletes, or should it be the World Anti-Doping Agency, or even someone completely different? My next argument is that requiring the athletes to give up their genetic information would be a violation of their privacy. While not only could their information be leaked, they also have the concern of their family's information being leaked. There's a lot on the line for athletes and their families here. A counter to allowing athletes to keep their privacy would be that requiring athletes to be genetically tested is essential for the integrity of sports. Sports are about who works the hardest and who does the best job. Allowing athletes who put in the work and to be routinely beat by athletes who do not is not okay. Additionally, requiring testing might advance medical technology. In our brave new world, everything is growing and we need to continue exploring. Genetic testing on athletes could open the doors to future research, perhaps even less invasive ways to test for gene doping in the future. This is a start that is much needed.
So my first argument is that the loss of privacy has the possibility to be beneficial to the test taker. These tests will give the participant a glimpse about their medical future. It will also inform them about what is in their gene pool. If the participant decides to have children, they will know whether they are a carrier for a genetic disorder or a mutation, and they could visit a genetic counselor. This is one of the many reasons why individuals participate in 23andMe. There is something in it for them. By participating in this testing, they are getting something out of it. My second argument is that the loss of privacy could result in your information being used for research on genetic disorders and diseases. Research done on genetic disorders and diseases is very highly valued research, and it can be used to help prevent or cure genetic conditions. Taking a genetic test and just checking the box to participate in research could help create future treatments, prevention strategies, and possibly save lives. This idea has a great connection to altruism, which is defined as the belief in or practice of disinterested and selfless concern for the well-being of others. The participant gives up a little bit of their privacy to help cure others. My first counterargument is that the loss of privacy could cause unnecessary angst about your future state of health. If there is something negative in the participant's genes, they could constantly worry about developing that condition or passing it on to offspring. Having a predisposition to a disorder or being a carrier for a gene does not mean that the condition will be developed or that it will be passed on to offspring. Also, developing a genetic condition is mostly inevitable. It's very difficult to control or prevent developing a genetic condition, so it's practically useless to worry about. My second counterargument is that genetic testing breaches the privacy of your family members. Because you are retrieving information about your gene pool, you are also retrieving information about what lies in the gene pool of your relatives.
After hearing both the informational and ethical portions of the presentations, please answer at least one of these questions in the chat. If you're comfortable, please expand on your answer beyond a yes or no when appropriate.
So would you participate in a 23andMe test?
And what is your final stance on gene doping? Do you think athletes should be required to submit a DNA test for gene doping? Why or why not?
What ethical considerations related to either topic are more important to you? Sorry, to the next one. So we'll give you a minute or so to answer these questions, or just one of them. So as the answers come in for these questions, I am seeing a majority of no, that anyone would not participate in a 23andMe test. I have seen a few yeses, but the vast majority of the people in this presentation have answered no, which is very interesting that your opinion changed from 50-50 to no.
And in terms of gene doping, I'm seeing a pretty split result for some people who believe we should do the invasive testing and others who believe we should not. But most of you have agreed that athletes should be tested some way, somehow.
And we can move on. So here are just some questions for further thinking. Just think about these in your head. So the first question is, do you think that 23andMe tests should still be sold?
And my question is, do you think gene doping actually levels the playing field as opposed to making it unfair? And if some people are doing it, should everybody be doing it? So just continue thinking about these questions. So thank you so much for listening. And we are now going to open up the floor to any questions you might have for either of us.
And just to let you know, we have about 4 minutes left in this session for questions.
I guess I have a question for both of you. Did you find that either of your positions on these topics changed because of your research with them?
I can actually speak to that. One of the reasons that I researched 23andMe was because how harmful it seemed in the beginning. You just think, oh, I'm submitting my genetics, they'll give me some information on my health and my ancestry. I mean, who doesn't want to know where they came from? But as I delve into research and research this topic more deeply, I found out how dangerous it could truly be. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was the unnecessary angst that could be caused. Because if you find out that you have a potentially dangerous disease lying in your future, or if you have Alzheimer's, personally, I would be constantly worrying about developing that condition. And there's nothing you can do really to stop it. So I just think it would have a very negative psychological impact on me.
My position didn't necessarily change all too much. When I began researching this, I did think we definitely should be testing athletes for gene doping, but I wasn't quite sure how they would go about doing this. And I did think that the genetic testing process was invasive at first. But as I did more research and realized that there are no ways developed as of right now to test for gene doping, and that one of the starts could potentially be submitting a genetic test at this moment in time, I do think that this is what we should be doing, at least for the near future, before we can look beyond that.
Thanks.
I have a question, actually. I was wondering about how you said for doping was used to increase the chances of winning. What about doping to decrease? Because I know there's a female athlete who had some male hormones in her body that gave her an advantage when competing. Do you think that is ethical or should have the same regulations as using it to increase your chances?
I will say I did not research that necessarily as much, because that does get into a whole different realm in terms of transgender athletes and their ability to compete. But I do think at this moment in time, there has to be a lot more research done on doping to increase or decrease performance in the situation that you're asking about. So I think that there's not enough information, and I don't have enough information to give you a concrete answer on that, but I think that in future years, we will be able to talk about that more.
Thank
Okay,
you.
I have one last question that came into the chat. If everyone is gene doping and that's the playing field, aren't we exposing athletes to potential harm for our spectator pleasure. So what is our role and responsibility as sports fans?
I think our role and responsibility as sports fans would be to support athletes somehow, but continue just as spectators, because most of the time we aren't watching for people who are doping regularly. Typically, those are not people who we are backing. But in the sense where everyone to do it, I think that raises a question to us as spectators of what's the point of sports in general? And I think our role would be to maybe raise that question to anti-doping agencies and things like that, because that really does take away what we were meant to do and what sports has become and what it was meant to be originally.
Well, thank you. And thank you for opening our eyes to different perspectives and views of these amazing topics. And congratulations, if anyone wants to unmute themselves and give them a hand of applause, that would be great.
Yes.
Wonderful job, girls. And thank you all for coming. We're going to end the session now. And please join us at the closing session.